All right, good afternoon, the three of you. All right, so we have Ali, Jeff, Southwick. Okay, so before I begin, are there any questions or anything that I need to be aware of? You guys doing okay? All right, good. Thank you, Jeff. All right. So I want to go ahead and get right into the material, okay? Uh, so what we're doing today is background information on antebellum westward expansion. Remember, antebellum just means before the war, before the Civil War, that is, right? And you see where we are going to greatly enhance uh, the jurisdiction of the United States, right? So you see there with the Louisiana Purchase, remember that was put under territory status. North and South were put under hand-picked governing boards of about 21 men. They they were to have according to the Northwest Ordinance, they were to have the Land Survey Office come out and survey the land first, put it into a system, right, of municipalities and counties and later states. They get up to a certain number. At one time, it was like 60,000. Then you could apply for, you could have a general election for people to go to a state convention, devise a state constitution, and then it's to be approved by Congress, right? And the land is supposed to be, offered to the general public for sale. And so there was a methodical process that was to be carried out, right? But in 1848, that was somewhat, circumvented with the gold rush. And it was kind of there was permitted like a mad dash to the west for this mineral wealth, enhanced by a proclamation made by President James Polk, the same president who arguably, began a war in 1846 with Mexico. Now, for 9 years prior to that, Texas was its own republic. 1836, right? March of 1836 was the famous Alamo. We're going to go over that a little bit. And the primarily Anglo Texans, a few Tejanos, ethnic Hispanic Texans, broke free from Mexico and were a republic. It was its own republic from 1836 to at least 1845 when they moved to have it annexed as a new state. And that was part of the Mexican American War, causes thereof as well. And then we had issues, diplomatic issues that never actually, escalated to war with Great Britain over the Oregon Territory. All right. So you see the territories there that now, of course, we're long accustomed to having belonged to the states. But this is how that came about, basically. Then you have the overland trails here. This one just has the Oregon and the California Trail. I should have had another picture that shows the Santa Fe Trail to the south, but they were the most famous overland trails. They were largely traversed in such numbers that it became famous in the 1840s. Okay, and we're going to touch on that as well. And the overarching theme for today, right, regarding your argumentative assignment is Turner's thesis. Okay, and Turner is going to make the argument basically of American exceptionalism, right? Whereby he states that America uniquely, as far as what constitutes Americana to him, is fluidity. It's a land of opportunity where people can rise or fall by merit, by talent, hard work, pluck, and luck, right? And he said that the West helped ensure that we would be such a country, that the West, it was kind of provided a clean slate, if you will, whereby nepotism and some of the vestiges of English privilege and patronage system and mercantilist system, somewhat survived on the East Coast. Everything is going to be made anew in the West, right? And today, a lot of people find, heavy fault with Turner's thesis for several reasons. For one, they think it smacks of almost environmental determinism, that a frontier of some sort is going to almost automatically create an egalitarian society where it puts everyone on equal footing. Uh, you look at Argentina, Brazil, other areas of frontier settlement, and it did not necessarily, you know, come out that way. People argue that he that it was erroneous and very convenient to virtually claim that the West was a clean slate for everyone when it was inhabited by Native Americans, by inhabitants of Louisiana under France and under Spain, right? Under Mexico and Spain, in California, New Mexico, and Texas, etc. And so that, you know, he's conveniently ignoring that. Some people also argue that it was not a land of opportunity, that, like anywhere else, it takes money to make money, and the wealthy already had a huge advantage over those who did not have the same capital or money to begin with that they had. And then, of course, they contend that it doesn't take into consideration properly uh, racial and other types of discrimination that people faced as impediments, right, or hurdles in their quest to the American dream. All right, but the two categories whereby he kind of creates this narrative is, for one, right, is he contends that there were equal opportunities virtually in the West. Okay, namely access to land, cheap or affordable land, aplenty, um, entrepreneurial, right? Starting a business. If you were quick enough on your feet, it didn't matter if you had not, attained anything on the East Coast. You had a clean slate and many opportunities to start some sort of a business if you were enterprising and shrewd enough. And also, right, he highlights the dangers of the West, the whole Wild West image, right? Because, I'm, for one reason, I think of like Joseph Campbell, and he talks about similarities in mythology and different civilizations and literature and even religion and so forth, themes that are shared. And one theme that he goes over is the hero's journey, and kind of nothing ventured, nothing gained, the sense that you undergo character development. You become a better person when you face obstacles, when you face dangers, right? And so uh, Frederick Jackson Turner, he also has an undergirding kind of Darwinian theme to it as well, right? That the weak, the sickly, the unlucky, they're going to die out in the West, and those who are hardworking, talented, and lucky are going to make it. But the beauty of it in his thesis, right, is that it doesn't matter what your demographic was as you move to the West. That there was a general level playing field for everyone, right? In this supposedly rough and tumble West. Okay. Are there any comments or questions so far? All right. So moving down here. So discourse on the West really opened up, as well as business opportunities for fur trapping in particular in the 1820s. Fur hats, fur coats really became in vogue. On one source, it contends that the profit margin could go as high as 800%, right? The cost of a beaver pelt or an otter pelt, as opposed to selling it as a final product in China, for instance, could go up 800%. Some of the sources I'm using, right? Perhaps not the best sources, but I enjoyed them. I say not the best in the sense that I like to historiographically be up to date, because normally they incorporate old history books and they have a new take on things and so forth. So it's nothing against these authors; they're just not totally up to date. That's all. So I had David Derry, The Oregon Trail. I relied upon that with the Hispanics. I use my memory from several actually. Teaching a Mexican American history class. You have Jorge and Eber's Hispanics in the Southwest, or I'm sorry, in the West. Hispanics in the West is a good book. Felipe Armesto Diaz, he has Our America. That's very interesting. You have uh, is it Gutierrez and his I have it back here on my bookshelf. I apologize. I don't recall it, but it's that's another big author. You have El Norte, right? By Carrie Gibson. I relied some of my information on that. Also, he's a popular historian. He dabbles in lots of different. He teaches at the University of Texas. Dabbles in lots of subjects. H.W. Brands is a popularly read historian. His book on the West, and then this is almost like a textbook by John MacFarriger, The American West: An Interpretive History. So these are some of the sources I utilized on this assignment if you wanted to have the time and interest to look further into it. This is a very fascinating and factually dense subject, right? And we're just kind of hitting the surface. So at any rate, with the mountain men, it really became in vogue. There, I'm going to butcher this. I don't know French, but the courrier des bois, literally runners of the forest. The French uh, developed a reputation for independently moving into these uncharted territories, assimilating with the Native Americans, meeting at the famous rendezvous points once a year to trade furs and kind of like a big flea market, if you will, and bringing the furs to market, right? And then, of course, you had monopolies that were granted by like the Hudson Bay Company of England, the Muscovy Company of Russia, and other companies, right, that are going to go along the West Coast and trade with the Inuit and the tribes of Washington, modern day Washington and Oregon, and they're going to gain a foothold in the Oregon Territory. And as you saw on the map, the Oregon Territory was comprised of present day Oregon, Washington, Idaho. I think just Idaho. I'm not sure if it went further east than that, but it was a larger territory than just the state of Oregon, obviously. But at any rate, by way of commercial infiltration, the British are going to begin to claim that land, okay, in Eurocentric fashion. And so what started out as monopolies, right, is going to somewhat become more capitalistic in time. It's going to evolve whereby people like Manuel Lisa of Spain, right, are going to begin to they're going to advertise on the east coast of the United States, right, not just with other Spaniards, and he's going to try to recruit workers. And then workers come, right, and they work for the Muscovy, the Hudson Company, etc., and they began to go off independently on their own, right? And that's going to be the story of like John Jacob Astor, right? A German immigrant who's going to rise from rags to riches in the fur industry, and he's going to be so successful as an independent entrepreneur. Not only becomes one of the wealthiest men in the country here, but they're literally going to name Astoria, like an American foothold, into that area after him. And then, of course, you're going to have a lot of Americans will move in the 1840s into the Willamette Valley. And that's going to be kind of the origin of our diplomatic leverage, if you will, with England, having so many Americans in, quote, Oregon territory, whereby future Democratic presidents like Polk are going to try to claim that land. Okay. So with the fur trapping, 1820s was a big time. And beginning at this time, you're going to get famous mountain men, the generic term was, right? Who become famous by selling the rights to their stories, their biographies, because they're going to have very dramatic stories, right? Of literally of bear attacks, Native American extortion, almost starving to death, et cetera, et cetera. Like there was a guy named Robert Stewart during the War of 1812 who traveled across pretty close to what would later become the Oregon Trail, but from west to east, right? During the war, and he sold the rights to his story, and it reads like a like an Odyssey, like a Homer's Odyssey. At one point, some of the men were so thirsty they drank their own urine. They even dabbled with the idea of drawing lots as to kill and then eat certain people. They were extorted by Crow Native Americans on at least one occasion. They tried to get around the Mandan Mountains because they were so afraid of the Blackfoot tribe. So lots of dramatic conflict that the reading public just ate up. And so you had people like Jedediah Smith, Kit Carson, right, Bridger, these other names that became famous. And then what they'll later do in the 1840s is they will sell their services as guides, if you will, and take expeditions of people along the trails, because after all, right, who better knows the safest routes, shortcuts, can accommodate diplomatic relations with Native American tribes that may not take too kindly to those infiltrating their lands, etc. And so all this is happening tied to the fur trade, right, and to the famous mountain men. Then the 1840s, the missionary movements really came of age, particularly the Baptist and Methodist denominations. And you're going to have stories that make the West famous, like the Whitman family, right? Who move into the Oregon Territory and they're butchered by the Native Americans. But in the popular press, right, it was almost as if they were martyred. And there was this great outcry amongst the churches in the East to send missionaries there to quote save the souls of the Native Americans. You even had a story of Native Americans. I apologize, I can't recall the tribe that supposedly came to a St. Louis fair, and this may be just apocryphal, but the public ate it up. Whereby they were told basically, okay, you showed me all the fun things there are to do here in the United States. You showed me all your commercialism and recreation in your products, but we want your great book. We want your Bible and your religion. And so there was a sense of shame amongst the churches that they need to go and spread the gospel. And remember, with Christianity, it's exclusive, right? It claims to have the only God and the only way to heaven through Jesus. And so, hence that kind of paternalistic noblesse oblige felt by Christianity to spread its wings to people that are quote living in darkness, right? And so at any rate, then you had a couple expeditions that in some histories today, like especially with conflict history, thinking of winners and losers and focusing on conquest and conflict, they look at these as quote Trojan horses, right? Like with the story of the Mycenaeans sneaking into the Trojan horse, and the Trojans inviting the horse into their walls, and then the Mycenaeans come out in the middle of the night and attack them, right? That they were unwittingly opening the gates into British Oregon and into Mexican California, precisely because of two. I define it as two generic adjectives in my mind, right? And that is, one is that they were virtually harmless. They came as family units. They were teachers and missionaries and carpenters, etc. They brought their wives and children with them. So it was the Whitman Spalding group that came into Oregon, and the British governor there was McLaughlin, and he began allowing Americans in large numbers to settle into the Willamette Valley. And then it was Vallejo, that Vallejo is named after Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, the comandante over the Mexican, Spanish and Mexican forces in California. He met with the Bidwell Bartleson group and declared that they were virtually harmless as well. The second adjective that I would ascribe to them, according to the primary sources, as far as the image that they conveyed to their hosts, was that they were enterprising. That term is going to be used a lot by Anglo Americans to excuse their imperialism, right? And that is basically just a broad name, and say, to me, it means that they're not only diligent workers and hardworking, but they're going to bring new progressive commercial development to your area, right? They're instituting sawmills and grist mills and getting markets going, and state-of-the-art productive processes, and bringing laborers with them, etc. And that it's going to benefit your colony by allowing them to come in. And as you probably know, there was a trusted middleman that Mexico put in the gap of the Sierra Nevada mountain range where they knew the gringos would likely come. And that was Johann von Suder, known as John Sutter, a Swiss immigrant who had done well for himself in the Hawaiian Islands as a cash crop farmer and businessman and creditor. And he's going to come in and he's to be kind of the unofficial policeman and liaison between Mexican California and the gringos that are coming into his valley, right, in the Sacramento Valley. And so, yeah, you have all that going on in the 1840s. And then, of course, it's going to culminate with the gold rush, right? The famous 49ers. You're going to have 80,000 that are just going to be registered along the Oregon Trail. And so that doesn't count the other ways that they could get there, right? By way of the Pacific, through the Isthmus of Panama, etc. So a huge rush, excuse me, came across, came into California during 49 alone. So then you have also the reality of the federal government intervening and promoting and subsidizing and helping facilitate movement to the far west, right? You have the Fifth Amendment that states that the government is to protect lives, liberty, and property of American citizens. So that was claimed. You have the lobbyist power of senators like Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri and other imperialistic senators who were all gung ho about moving Americans to the far west. And remember, you have lots of variables to keep in mind. For one, you have the faction thesis, right? And remember, that's the argument that like the term factionalism by Madison in the Federalist Papers, that people are primarily selfish and self-centered, and they're primarily led by self-interest. And so they're largely going to want to vote as politicians. They're going to want to make legislation as voters are going to vote. Primarily what's best for them, the demographic that they identify with, right? As a laborer, as a farmer, as an industrial worker, as an entrepreneur, or as a slave owning planter, etc., right? And the idea is that there was a feeling of inevitability, especially in the 1840s, with the term manifest destiny, that it's destined by God for Americans to spread their wings across the continent, and that those who would fall under the American flag should be grateful for such, because they will be afforded more economic opportunities and fluidity, and they'll be allowed more political participation and freedom, supposedly, under the American flag, right? So with this manifest destiny rhetoric and culture, etc., there was the notion that we're moving to the West inevitably anyway, so it might as well be our faction that spreads in that direction. Thomas Jefferson wrote and spoke of that fashion as well, wanting to get as many small subsistence and small cash crop farmers as possible to go and inhabit the West, so they could be future allies, political allies who would vote in a manner that was in line with what he stood for, right? And so you have all that's going to culminate in Civil War drama coming up, right? And trying to gain allies in the West. You also have the famous safety valve thesis, right? That survives in American history books. The notion that in a land where rhetoric is so high on opportunity for everyone, when that opportunity is not realized in reality on the East, right? That could eventually spring into some type of rebellion or even revolution. You give people, you saw that with Bacon's Rebellion, right? You give people expectations of rising up the socioeconomic ladder, and if they're not able for whatever reasons to do so, they become angry and they become a source of discontent. So, what better way to deal with that demographic than encourage them to go west and to get out of your hair and let them have an opportunity there? And not to mention, as we just mentioned under Jacksonian America, right? The whole quid pro quo system of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You vote for me as your politician, and I'll provide what you want, especially economically. And oftentimes that was easily, votes were easily bought just by promising them land. And what better way to do it, right? In the quote, undeveloped, I say quote, because it was inhabited by many demographics, but the quote, uninhabited West. So there were many reasons for people pushing into the West. And by all means, there were plenty of people who protested this. We're going to get to that next subject on the coming of the Civil War. You had the antebellum before the war reformers and idealistic, protesters and utopian builders, etc., who were not for spreading American territory into this area. You had people afraid of a civil war and factional conflict, and felt like the West was going to spring the North and South into a civil war. So not everyone was for it, but it certainly seems to have been popular enough that not only by numbers of people moving to the West, um, not only by primary sources of people writing in glowing terms about loved ones or themselves moving to the West, but also by the election, right? The popular election of politicians who put it in their platform that they were pro-Western imperialism, right? Moving Americans into that Western territory and developing it and eventually annexing those areas as new states. So at any rate, all this is happening, really picks up in the 1840s, okay? And and then not to mention economic incentives, right? But anyway, let's see here. So you have all that going on in the 1840s. You had a couple expeditions as well. They were called zoological and topographical expeditions, right? Whereby technically they were supposed to be just scientific, kind of like Lewis and Clark and Zebulon Pike. John C. Fremont was the most famous of those expeditions, right? His wife is going to popularize his trips to the West, as well as his father-in-law, Thomas Hart Benton. But at any rate, he's going to move there, and he's supposed to be looking at the flora and fauna, the plant and animal life, the geography, uh, information about the Native American cultures and tribes, etc. But on two occasions after his first trip, two more times he crosses the Sierra Nevada and goes into Sutter's Camp into Mexican California. And by the third time, he was arrested and detained for a while as a possible spy, right? And Mexico began really fearing American imperialistic designs, especially after there had been much dialogue in Congress about annexing Texas in the 1830s and early 1840s. So you have all that going on in the 1840s, giving the West a lot of publicity. You had writings that became famous, like Richard Dana. Richard Dana is going to visit Mexican California, and his characterization of it is very condescending. He talks about how beautiful it is. He gives us the negative and positive stereotypes of the Latinos living in that land, how they're very well dressed and well cultured and classy and hospitable. The weather is beautiful. Not only the climate, but just the ecosystem and everything is just gorgeous, and almost this this paradise like place, right? And but then he has a famous quote where he says, "In the hands of an enterprising people, basically, what a land this could be." And so he pretty much states, right, that Latino people are not progressive and enterprising enough, that they don't quote deserve. That's not a direct quote, but I mean that's my paraphrase of it. That they don't deserve. They're not making good use of that land. And so just imagine what Americans could do with California. And so you had writings like that were well read. It was called 7 Years at the Mast, and it became, kind of equivalent of a bestseller when it was published in the East. So going on again with the federal subsidization of the West, they established forts. They established the Pony Express and postal system. They began putting telegraph wires right through Morse code, putting uh, um, uh, messages quickly across. Right, they had message in gift barrels at certain key points, right? They provided at St. Louis and other places of Missouri, the starting points of the overland trails, maps and supplies that they offered, right? To help migrants on their way, etc. And so the federal government is going to pretty much overtly promote movement to the West and try to help it, try to facilitate it. All right. Then in the 1830s, you're going to have drama with Texas, whereby it is taken, right, from Mexico by a Texan rebellion that was largely Anglo-American in background. Okay. It's going to begin with very generous concessions by the Mexican government, whereby it's going to offer a good amount of land for free, a certain amount of time of tax exemption, right? And all the rights of Mexican citizenship to any Anglo Americans that want to come into this district, if you will, known as Austin, right? Named after Moses Austin, who was granted this under Spain, and then it was inherited and renewed for his son Stephen Austin, and they were to be kind of like Johann von Suter. They demonstrated their loyalty to the Mexican government. They were asked in return, right, to learn and conduct business in Spanish language, to be baptized as Roman Catholic Christian, to be and to abide by Mexican law. They were encouraged to integrate and marry Hispanic women, etc. Right, and so when you do conflict history, about the gringos coming in and stealing this land, like Chicano history, right? Stephen Austin is a very interesting figure, because for quite some time he is going to demonstrate loyalty to the Mexican government. For instance, the Fredonian Revolt. Um, Two brothers and get a band together. And this was just the most famous of several occasions whereby Americans are going to come in and try to declare independence from Mexico and take this land. And Stephen Austin is going to fight against them with the Mexican authorities and putting these rebellions down. He is going to issue complaints and requests to the Mexican government, basically for resources, for soldiers, and for help, right? Saying that, here, excuse me, contending that, excuse me, that the original generation was, he said, was more compliant and more easily held in check just by their low numbers. They began with only about 300 people. But before you know it, they're going to go up into the tens of thousands, and they're going to outnumber the Tejanos, the ethnic Mexican Texans, 8-1. And so at that point, right, he begins complaining and saying, hey, a lot of these newer Americans that are coming in, I can't control. I don't have enough soldiers and resources, and they're not abiding by Mexican requirements. They're not learning Spanish. They're not becoming Roman Catholic. They're not culturally assimilating and socially. And also, they're defying Mexican law in that the 1824 Constitution was very liberal under Mexico, right? That they were under. It allowed a lot of federal latitude to the states and the localities. Um, it allowed, certain individual rights. It allowed representative government and election of the local leaders, etc. But it also set the stage for political equality of all men. And then that was finalized in the 1830s, just before this, so that it had become clear Mexico outlawed slavery. And some of these Americans defied that. They brought slaves in. So at any rate, he wrote about that as well. And so then you had the arrival of Mier y Terán and his expedition, and they're going to have a very cynical report when they traveled up and visited this Anglo colony in Texas, and just all of Mexican Texas in general, stating that the people were defiant and haughty. And right, haughty is that you're arrogant and you think the rules that apply to others don't need to apply to you. Um, and they were not paying their taxes, even when their tax exemption time had come. Because you had people like John Bradford Davis, who showed loyalty to the Mexican government and was responsible for taxing American exports to nearby Louisiana at a place called Anahuac. And he was attacked on more than one occasions by other Americans for being seen as kind of a kiss up and a sellout to his American people and a kiss up to the Mexican government, and they did not want to be taxed. You also have to add, and I don't want to add too much to this because I don't want to stereotype or stigmatize, but you had a reputation, right, of a lot of these immigrants uh, being Scots Irish in background. We talked about that last subject with Jacksonian America, with Andrew Jackson in particular, right? The Scots Irish, their primary source material that labels them by governments in England, in Scotland, in the Carolinas, in Tennessee, contending that the Scots Irish, right, were a very libertarian, fiercely libertarian and rebellious people, right? That they did not want Big Brother telling them how to live their lives. They a very strong, hateful distrust of government of any sort, of any level. And so, you might have to keep that in mind as well. And not to mention the very type of people, right, that are going to be attracted to moving in to a foreign country just because of the economic incentives, right? So perhaps you're getting, we went over this like with the conquista of the Spaniards, right? You're getting a certain type of people that are going to take this offer and move there. So at any rate, you had people that are later going to be known as war hawks, right? Like William Barrett Travis, Sam Houston, a guy with the last name Henry. Others, right, who were going to very early show their true colors, that they wanted this land independently for themselves, right? And so with Austin, after Mieri Terran's expedition returned to Mexico, the Mexican government, two administrations, three administrations in a row, Anastasio Bustamante, then Gomez Farias after him, and they were very conservative to very liberal, those two. And then Santa Anna, who was on both sides of the spectrum at different times. All three of them adhered to the April 6th colonization law, stating that Americans had to abide by Mexican law or they would be deported, and there would be no more American immigration into Mexican Texas allowed. And so Stephen Austin came down and complained about it, tried to be like the middleman, and he had an ego clash, according to the primary sources, with Gomez Farias, and he was arrested for a little over a year and put into a prison cell. And he supposedly became dejected and wrote a letter to the Cabildo, the city council of San Antonio, Texas, stating, "Hey, I tried to be the referee, the adjudicator, but they're not budging." What he tried to contend for the on behalf of the Americans was the obvious, to try to reopen American immigration into Mexican Texas, and also he contended, right, that he was not philosophically for slavery, but that it was inevitable that there had to have been some type of compromise with the Americans over slavery. And a popular compromise that was in political discourse at that time was like gradual compensated emancipation, whereby all slaves up to the age of 30 were to be kept, and those above 30, for instance, were to be bought like an eminent domain fashion at market price. And then after that generation died out, that's all they could do. That's just one example of a system of gradual compensated emancipation. And the Mexican government would have none of it. And so now the Warhawks are going to begin meeting in secret, even going so far as making Minuteman groups, militia groups, right, who are ready to defend their rights even by violence if need be. So, according to Chicano historians, right, the new Constitution of Santa Ana may have just been a convenient pretext, a so-called excuse for them to rebel, that they were wanting this land anyway, uh, and perhaps there's a lot of truth to that. But what they're going to contend, and what we learned as children in court American history, right, is that this new constitution was unbearable to them, and perhaps, of course, there could be truth to both. So at any rate, when you look at Santa Anna's two constitutions, right? He had the Siete Leyes, like the name of an old law of Spain, the seven laws. He had the Bases Organicas as well, and they were very very conservative. For instance, he labeled the states as his departments now, rather than as semi-independent states, like in our federal republic, right? And he declared that he would handpick the governors, and no longer would they be um, elected. Then at the local level, many of the local offices that had been elected since under Spain, they were to be handpicked by his handpicked governors. So as far as representative government, it really was, perhaps in peril, and greatly, you know, um, curtailed, right, cut short with this new constitution. So at the Alamo, right, you had people with flags stating "Return to the Constitution of 1824." So to their dying breath, some of those who fought and died at the Alamo contended that they were fighting for federal, local representation, local government, local autonomy, and freedom, right? So Zacatecas, I'm trying to think of another state as well, initially defied this new constitution under Santa Anna, and he crushed the Zacatecan militia and deposed her governor. And then he stated that Coahuila y Tejas, because Coahuila in Texas, right, Coahuila beneath it, were connected as one state, said that they were next. So there in Saltillo, the Coahuilans, they backed down, and the Texans did not. And so he sent his army up, and under his brother-in-law, Perfecto de Cos, came up to one of the presidios, one of the military forts, and these local war hawks, largely Anglo, had taken over um, one of the presidios, and they were ordered to evacuate, and instead they fired upon De Cos. And he reported to Santa Anna, and Santa Anna said, "Okay, I'm coming for sure now." So his army came up, right? And then famously at the Alamo, right? Alamo, which was once a mission, and then like algodon, cotton. The Alamo was a place where they manufactured cotton. So it had a couple different uses prior to this. It was rather kind of an insignificant building, and it becomes famous because of this event, right? Is some of the rebel leaders decided that they were going to fight no matter what and stand their ground at this building. So there are about 200 of them. They had some Tejanos there. Juan Seguin and Erasmo Seguin were part of the rebellion, um, but they were primarily Anglos. Okay, and then what made matters worse is when they got in desperate straits, William Barrett Travis wrote a circular up to the U.S. asking Americans to come and help fight for the liberty of the Texans and for the independence of Texas. And he put in his language some racist rhetoric, contending that these were a backward people, this was a backward country, and it needed to be put in the hands of liberty loving Anglo Americans. And so, like I said, you have a political element of like local autonomy, local representative democracy, a federal country, right, with shared power between states and localities and the central government. And you also had a downright racist component. And you also had, right, an economic component to it as well. And so they're going to fight and die there at the Alamo. Then at the goal at place called Goliad, um, Santa Anna is going to, the guy there under Santa Anna is going to promise them freedom and pardon if they put down their arms. They did. And when they evacuated Goliad, Santa Anna overrode his decision and declared that they were to all be executed. And all this came up into the US, and Americans began flooding in there to help the cause. And so Sam Houston, right, and others are they're gonna run from Santa Anna's army for quite some time. And kind of like in Sun Tzu's Art of War, sometimes you not only hit the enemy where they are weak, but you sometimes ironically hit them where they know they're strong because they won't expect it. And that's what Sam Houston did. Um, they the Mexican army was in three, and the night that they united, there was, probably not much of a thought that they would be attacked now that they had been united, right? And that's exactly when and where the largely Anglo rebels hit them, right? And they captured Santa Ana, and in return for his life, he signed over Texas. But the Diputacion, the Congress of Mexico, they quickly gave an ultimatum to the United States, stating that if you even contemplate, if you even vote on um, annexing this Texas, right, as a new American state, it will mean war, basically. We'll cut off diplomatic relations, and we'll even mobilize our army. So that was a system, a source of much friction, Texas. So from 1836 to 1845, it's going to be independent as its own country. But then in 45, first lame duck president John Tyler and James K. Polk are going to just unilaterally, or I say unilaterally, but sadly, there's evidence for it being uh, somewhat popular of a cause. They asked for Texas to be annexed by Congress. Particularly, the Democratic Party was imperialist in its platform and wanting the Mexican West. And Polk made no bones about it. He easily plays the white devil, if you will, in Chicano history books. And so, at any rate, um, it's going to begin the Mexican American War because of that, and also because of a border dispute that Chicano historians contend was a manner by which Polk was picking a fight, if you will, right? And so Polk is going to he's going to contend against the Adams-Onis Treaty. There was another treaty after that. They established two different rivers as the border between Mexico and the United States. One was the Nueces River. Gosh, I don't know if I have it on here. I can't remember the name of the other one. I think it was the Sabine. Yeah, the Sabine River. And so, but neither of them contended that it was the Rio Brazos or the Rio Grande, right? Or Rio Bravo del Norte. There were several names to it. But the Rio Grande, as we call it today, right? That initially in none of the treaties was supposed to be um, the border. And also the irony, right? When you look at the difference between the Nueces and us wanting to go a little further south with our border down to the Rio Grande, uh, Chicano historians have sarcastically noted that this is some of the most unfertile land in North American continent. So why do we really want to fight for that little strip of land? Again, they contend that Polk was trying to pick a fight. And that's exactly, if he was intending that, that's exactly what happened. Is Americans were sent past the Sabine and the Nueces up to the Rio Grande. So by Mexican law, under the Spanish treaties, they already were on Mexican soil, right? Even being on the quote American side of the Rio Grande. And then an expedition of cavalrymen were eventually attacked after several days of a tense, kind of uh, situation. And I can't remember how many, I want to say like 18 or maybe a fewer than that, Americans were killed in the melee. And so Polk famously goes to the Congress and declares that American blood has been shed on American soil and the cup of forbearance has overflown. We've put up with Mexico long enough, and we need to declare war. And another thing he was angry about is he sent two gentlemen as ambassadors to try to purchase Mexican California, and on both occasions they were rebuffed, and he did not take kindly to that. So, at any rate, war is declared. There were two large armies. One under Zachary Taylor went into northern Texas, into Coahuila, and fought at places like Resaca de Palma, Saltillo, Buena Vista was a big battle if you wanted to look that up. We were very fortunate that the Mexican army literally gave up at Buena Vista. We had an entrenched system of about 4 trenches, and our guys are back on their final fourth trench and running out of ammunition. And Santa Anna and his army decided to quit, that they were out of food and they were running low on ammunition, and they left, literally. Then you have places down in the south, like with the army of Scott, right? George Winfield Scott and his army uh, symbolically went the route that Hernan Cortez had gone to conquer the Aztec. They eventually came and they conquered and I don't know if I'd say conquered, but they occupied Mexico City itself. And if you look at the Battle of like Chapultepec down there, a lot of bloody fighting. The war wasn't that long. There weren't a lot of battles, but some of them were very bloody, like Chapultepec. Um, and then also Cerro Gordo. And Cerro Gordo was an example of American technological superiority, whereby they were able to get artillery up a parapet and up a hill and over a canyon that the Mexican army did not think was possible. And then on a couple famous occasions, the Mexican army was fighting amongst themselves and refused to help one another. And so you have all of those components to this. The Mexican army also didn't was short on ammunition. Some of the men literally were brought into battle without guns, without functioning guns, or with archaic muskets. And so America is going to succeed militarily in this war. They're going to occupy Mexico City. They even dabble with the idea of annexing Mexico, the states of Mexico, believe it or not. And ironically, right, some of the largest factions that lobbied against annexing any of Mexican, contemporary territory were actually racist in rhetoric, contending they did not want to integrate these, quote, brown mestizo people, right? Mestizo, indigenous, and Spanish and European people into the American Republic. And so, but of course, they were for taking states north of the Rio Grande, right? And so, namely, they were looking at New Mexico and California. In California, right? Like I'd mentioned, you had John C. Fremont. The second and third time that he made it into Mexican California, he did not have paperwork from the United States government contending that he had a right to do such. He acted very suspiciously. He goes back up into Oregon and he meets with a guy named Archibald Gillespie. And we know from hindsight that Gillespie was a spy for the American government and military. He also was trying to extort and get the cooperation of a guy named Thomas Oliver Larkin, an American who had was ostensibly abiding by Mexican law and living in Monterrey as a successful banker and businessman. And so you're going to have a degree of kind of espionage, right? And of Americans collaborating with the enemy of Mexico to hand Mexican California over to the Stars and Stripes. And you had gentlemen, right? Again, a lot of them were Scots Irish in origin, like Ezekiel Merritt, Lucas Graham, spelt like the graham cracker. Look up people like them. They had a very rebellious record and reputation in the primary sources as being troublemakers and rabble rousers for the Mexican California government. It didn't help that Mexico had a lot of tumultuous drama between its conservatives and liberals in Mexico itself and in California. At times, literally two different individuals claiming that they were the rightful governor of Mexican California. So you had Pio Pico, a guy named Juan Castro, a guy named Figueroa, lots of drama. And some of the defiant Americans are going to take advantage of that. So Ezekiel Merritt and others, right? They're going to go to the home of Comandante Vallejo and President Petaluma, and they're going to put him under house arrest. And when war is declared, right, they're going to hand him over to John C. Fremont, who conveniently was right at the Oregon border, heard about news of war, came right back into Mexican California when he was ordered not to ever return. and took as a prisoner, or actually he refused at first, um, uh, uh, the leader of the Mexican military. So Castro, and then down in the Southern California, Pio Pico are going to try to raise armies and fight against the Americans. The Americans are going to bring in people like Sloat, Sloate, Redford Stockton. They're going to come along the coast by way of the Navy to like Monterey, San Francisco, and LA, and bring forces to fight against the Mexican soldiers. And then you're going to have a guy named Kearney come through New Mexico by land into Southern California. And then, of course, you also had Fremont with their American soldiers. And so when this group of Americans put Vallejo under house arrest, they tried to ostensibly state, kind of like in Texas, that they were initiating their own Bear Flag Republic, that it was supposed to be independent of the Stars and Stripes, with the whole bear flag, with the bear and all that, right? However, why did they try to immediately hand him over to an American official, John C. Fremont, right? So again, it just smacks of American ungratitude and disloyalty amongst Americans who were here. And of course, you had other Americans who, as a minority, who successfully integrated and supposedly remained loyal to Mexico even throughout until the end of the war. And then you also have the contention, you have the interesting subtopic of people like Vallejo, who of course decried this, but yet he wanted Americans initially to come in, right? Because of his idea of American enterprise, because he was educated by Scottish and European and English tutors, and was taught to be cosmopolitan, a citizen of the world, and want people from all countries into Mexican California, especially those who were progressive and enterprising. And so he lamented the loss of Mexican California. He lost a lot of his own private personal lands. So he suffered for sure. But he continued to run as a politician. He tried to represent Hispanics, but he also did business with gringos and just moved on when Mexican California became an American state in 1850. So it's filled with interesting subtopics. The loss of Mexican California, and then how ironic, right? Sadly, ironic for Mexico, is the war was declared over on February 2nd, 1848, under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. That's supposed to be Hidalgo, not Hidalgo. Um, but and then look at this. January 24th, literally like 8 days before that, gold was discovered on Sutter's Mill, right? There were members of the Mormon Battalion who were working for Sutter, and they were trying to cut the American River in half, and thereby increase the pressure of the and the density of the current of the river, so that it could better push a sawmill, and they found gold at the bottom, right? So placer level or superficial level found in the riverbeds, etc., gold was discovered. And Governor Mason, the military governor for the time being, while it was a federal territory, technically, right? Gained from Mexico, taken from Mexico. Governor Mason came in and verified the discovery of the gold, sent famously a big chunk of gold to President Polk, and President Polk publicized, telling people, don't worry about the Northwest Ordinance of surveying all the land and putting it under certain jurisdictions and having open sales for it. He says, go ahead and whatever minerals you could find are yours. So he deliberately created a mad rush by way of the gold rush, right? That's going to create literally in some senses an element of anarchy in Gold Rush, California, whereby in the gold mines up through Sonora, up through the Sacramento Valley, you're going to have areas where they don't have a recognized municipal government, sheriff, police force, etc. And so the miners are going to come in, right? And here you get Turner's thesis of this rough, wild, rough and tumble West, but that it was supposedly open for whoever was tough, intelligent, shrewd, and lucky enough to make it. right? And so you have like the Alta California and other Spanish speaking newspapers that survive there that give reports and give some credence to this of a lot of crime, a lot of people claim jumping over others, whereby if you're by yourself or just with a small group and a numerically larger, well armed group comes in, they point their guns at you and tell you this mine is ours now. There was an element of that. And you're going to have a degree of like in San Francisco itself, which is going to really take off. You're going to have a degree of people forming vigilante groups or miners associations, whereby they're going to put law into their own hands, right? You had hanging trees in a lot of these famous places. So a famous book is The World Rushed In by J.S. Holiday, again, whom I personally subjectively like. H.W. Brands has a good book as well on the gold rush. And there are some great documentaries on it you could do on YouTube as well. So you do have some credence to this. Perhaps there's some justification for a little bit of truth to Turner's thesis about it there being a window period of semi anarchy and semi equality of opportunity at the beginning, at least, of the gold rush. All right, but you also have evidence right away of ethnic tensions being exacerbated or made worse by economic competition. So, for instance, Chileans came and made it early, and the Chileans were well versed in mining. They were kind of had a step up, a leg up on a lot of their Anglo contemporaries who had no uh, um, experience whatsoever and just flooded from Missouri, New Jersey, etc., never having mined their entire lives. So, needless to say, there was resentment toward the Chileans. You had Mexico immigrants from Sinaloa and Sonora who came up, and they named Sonora, the town of Sonora, after their home state, and did well for themselves. And there was resentment toward them as well for the same reason. And then, of course, the fact that you had, Californios, ethnic Mexicans who had been in Mexican California long before the gringos got there, but they were not physiologically differentiated from the Sonoran and Sinaloan immigrants from Mexico proper. And so, hence, and not to mention the Chileans. And so, then there was a sense, right, that all of these Latinos alike are foreigners. And even for those who could contend that they were Californios, the Anglo justification was, well, we just won the war fair and square. And so we won this land. These are the spoils of war. The gold should belong to us instead. So you have those components that are going to lend to a foreign miners law in 1850 in California legislator that is going to penalize and tax Hispanic miners. Um, you're going to have, you know, uh, violence against Hispanics. And that's where you're going to get people like Joaquin Murrieta, who was, the source of the legend of Zorro later on, who's going to be seen as this social bandit, right? This Mexican bandido who's going to fight for the rights of Mexican people, for their pride, their dignity. But he's not going to do it within the system, because within the system, right, trying to vote for somebody, trying to run for office, trying to engage in economic, entrepreneurial activities and do well for himself, he felt like those were all disqualified, that the Anglos were taking all those chances from Mexicans. So he fought outside the system, right? And he engaged in vigilante violence and theft primarily against Anglos. The story goes, and so yes,
Mr. Cowell,
yes,
are you going to be posting these notes up on Canvas?
sure, I'd be happy to.
Please, can you, just because I have to get going and get my kids early from school.
You got it.
Thank you so much.
No problem. No problem. All right. So there you get another fact, right? With found in Jorge Eber and Michael De Leon's book of Hispanics in the West, is they use the term proletarianization. They contend that Hispanics, right, were pigeonholed into the proletariat, into the laboring class, right? of this new industrializing economy. And so the idea is, right, is for one, they were actually placed there. That technically the opportunities to borrow money, to accrue a lot of land, were not open to them. Certainly, the chance of rising up the socioeconomic ladder, beginning as a manual laborer, they just were not promoted in the mines and on the railroads, etc. They just weren't. There are a lot of stats that prove that. So hence, right, that they were kind of forced to remain as manual laborers in menial jobs that didn't promise a lot of wealth, a lot of prestige, and a lot of future advancement. And then also that they were socially or culturally stigmatized, right? Contending that that's where Hispanics belong, with these essentialist arguments, right? Like nature versus nurture, that it's not nurture, that it's nature, that there's nothing that can be done about it, that biologically Hispanics are less intelligent. They're good at manual labor, but nothing else. That's where they belong. That's their lot. That's what they're good at, et cetera, et cetera. And that they can't be trusted anyway, etc. And so you get these myths and stereotypes about Hispanics, and that serve to conveniently, keep them bottled down in the proletariat. So they worked at service sector jobs, right? And sadly, we're familiar. We see vestiges of this to this very day, right? Uh, go on a vacation and go into a cheap motel or even a nice hotel, and chances are you'll get to work on your Spanish, right, with a criada, the person that's making the beds and cleaning the rooms, the cooks and cleaners and custodians, gardeners, the laborers out in the fields. That actually was a little bit slower into formation. Initially, supposedly, a lot of the laborers in California were Asian. A lot of them were Chinese, Korean, Filipino, especially, and other ethnicities. But by the end of the 1800s, it's going to largely be what we're familiar with now as Hispanic laborers. And so, it's a sad reality that Chicano historians remind us of. And so, to whatever extent that that is true statistically, how did Hispanics respond to it? Well, for one, right, like with Hispanic agency, um, for one, some sadly just resigned to it, right? But even those who resigned, right, as I have here, Hispanics by and large have maintained their culture very successfully. So they may have been marginalized economically, they may have been marginalized politically, but they retained their culture pretty darn well, pretty darn effectively. They look into statistics of like miscegenation, right? Of Hispanic women, especially who married Anglo men. By and large, they raised or reared their children in Hispanic culture pretty well. Roman Catholic, Spanish language, strong ties to the Catholic Church and Spanish traditions, etc. So, at any rate, some fought within the system. You look in New Mexico, right? The Armijo family and some of these part of the later, like the Santa Fe Ring, did very well for themselves in Santa Fe, New Mexico, despite gringo infiltration and the corporations coming to compete with them, etc. San Antonio, Texas, maintained a reputation for having a respectable white collar middle Hispanic class of like writers and journalists and professors and teachers, etc., and doctors and lawyers. Okay. Also, Los Angeles as well. Some fought within the system as politicians. You had like Esteban Ochoa as the Hispanic mayor of Tucson, Arizona, uh, time and time again elected and fought for the rights of his Hispanic constituents. You have what's interesting to me, the gorras blancas, the white hats. They initially fought outside the system, but then they became pretty much a political party and ran candidates and fought for the unionization of Hispanic laborers, et cetera, et cetera. And unionization is another one. You can look up like the Anaconda copper mines in Arizona. They largely employed and exploited Mexican American laborers. And so they fought for their rights to collectively bargain and get better working conditions and better wages and chances for advancement. Used the strike and the boycott and other tactics to fight for their rights. So some fought within the system, and then some fought beyond the system. You have Gregorio Cortina, you have Joaquin Murrieta, Tiburcio Vasquez, and these other like social bandits, if you will, right? Initially, the Gordas Blancas went and symbolically cut Anglo corporate barbed wire fences and let their cattle and sheep get out, etc., and sabotage different types of corporate mines, etc. And so those are some of the ways that Hispanics reacted to this. But also, what I kind of skipped is recall like the injustice done to Mexican Americans despite the promises of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Under that treaty, Mexican Americans, right? The idea is they didn't cross the border crossed them, right? Now they're under a new American flag, and they were guaranteed the rights of citizenship, including the right to their property. But the problem is in the courts, they were very stringent as far as proof of your ownership. They wanted latitude and longitude lines, exactly where your boundaries lay. They wanted a signature and date of the governing authorities at the time of that property being given to your ancestor, etc. And so those were tough requirements because many of them had retained their property through the Spanish government, right? When Mexico gained its independence in the early 1820s from Spain, it switched flags, and so some of them their property deeds were from Spain rather than Mexico. So some of them did not sufficiently prove their ownership or at least parts of their boundaries and lost it that way. Attorney fees were so expensive that some attorneys pretty much extorted them and said, if you want me to represent you in court, and I want your property as collateral. So if they win and if they couldn't pay all their fees, the lawyer took some of their. Ironically, the very lawyer that was supposed to defend them took some of their lands. Then Felipe Armesto contends that there was outright just violent extortion, whereby Americans would come in, Anglo Americans, and just force or threaten violence upon the Mexican ranchers and others, right? To take at least some of their land. And then you had the fact, right, that from the 1830s, American jurisprudence had really liberalized into granting opportunities to squatters to gain parcels of other people's land. That if the person had not inhabited it for a certain number of months or years, if the person had not cultivated it for a certain period of time, they were given the opportunity to buy the portion of the land that they were inhabiting and improving, or in some cases, even have it, which is crazy because under English common law, your property is your property, right? They were big on property rights from our English political tradition and English common law, but it really democratized during Jackson's time, right? Trying to win votes. And so people came, and a lot of the Mexican ranchers, right, were just that. They had ranches. They were pastoral with sheep or cattle, and as you see going up 108, right? I to this day wonder what extent is this public domain in this hill country, and what extent is it privately owned by individuals, right? It's hard to know. And so on pastoral land, there are lots of chunks of land that you can't tell at a given time if it's claimed by anybody. So they would sit on parcels of it and claim their right to that small part of it because the rightful owner was not cultivating or using it. And so for those and other reasons, Mexican Americans lost a lot of land, a lot of acreage, despite the promises of this treaty. All right. And then of course you have Asian immigrants. And you had this coolie system, COOLIE, that existed in the Hawaiian Islands and in the Pacific, whereby these planters in the Hawaiian Islands and elsewhere, they were contracting like a modern day form of indentured servitude. These desperate or sometimes even shanghaied, kidnapped Asian immigrant workers to work off their debts that were incurred by taking care of them, feeding and clothing them during all this time of their tenure. And so that was extended from the Hawaiian Islands to a certain degree into California. And so you have the big sugar companies and others, and then the railroads are going to jump on board, right? Most famously, Charles Crocker of the Big Four of the Central Pacific Railroad. He had heard about this, and he tried an experiment with a certain number of Chinese immigrant laborers, and they worked so well for him that he began hiring them in larger and larger numbers. And he had a famous bet with Durant of the Union Pacific that they could lay a mile of track in a day, and they did so easily. And so they developed this reputation for being very efficient as laborers, right? Doing a lot in a short amount of time. But the second adjective, right, that was ascribed to them was dangerous, and that was that they were docile, right? And if you're docile, you're meek, you're humble, you're mild, you do as you're told, you're not defiant, right? And so, hence, what are we talking about? We're talking about the perfectly exploitable laborer, the guy who will do as he's told without any questions asked, and do a very efficient job, right? So you have a book called Strangers from a Different Shore by a guy named Takaki. Very, very factually rich, fascinating book on Asian immigration to the United States. I highly recommend it. He gets into numbers and it's just crazy. At any given time, there were about 40,000 Chinese immigrant laborers working on the Continental Railroad. They were exploited and put into positions that were very dangerous, like hanging from the Sierra Nevada mountains in a little reed basket in a rope to chisel in dynamite sticks of nitroglycerin and hopefully be pulled up in time by the time it exploded. They died in avalanches and explosions from exhaustion and dehydration. It was just crazy what they went through and how badly they were exploited. They tried to go on a strike, and the Central Pacific threatened to abandon them in the desert in the Great Basin, and so they had to give in, and the strike didn't work. They were attacked in cities like Denver by other ethnic groups. In this case of Denver, it was by Mexican American laborers who resented them, quote, taking their jobs. The Irish unionized strongly in California and were very anti-Chinese immigration, right? Because they were contending that they were taking their jobs and willing to work for a lower salary. Also, some of the Chinese gained a reputation for entrepreneurial success, right? Whereby they were starting restaurants and hostels or inns, and of course, famously laundromats. And you had one famous case, right, whereby they were contending that the Chinese had a vat that they would empty the pockets of those they were cleaning their clothes and get the gold dust uh, from the pockets of each person that they were charging to clean his or her clothing, right? And that it was accumulated in great barrels. And you had a mob of angry people come into their business and physically assaulted them. To what extent that was true, I know not, but it almost doesn't matter. It was just one more thing that added to this anti-Asian xenophobia, right? At this time. So how ironic, right? That when they instituted the Chinese Exclusion Act, Congress did in 1882, long after California had its own state discriminatory laws. Um, they actually put in those two positive stereotypes about the Asians in the midst of discriminating against them, that they were a very efficient and diligent people, right? Um, and docile and the ideal laborer, but it also contended that they were unassimilable, right? Like they stated about the Native Americans in the Trail of Tears, that they were unwilling and unable to assimilate because they came, right, and they had the Manchurian Q haircut. They had the pantaloon pants with the big hats. They were morphologically right different physiologically with their faces. They could not, if they wanted to, fit in. And there in the newspapers, they had quotes like the yellow peril because there was news that some of the industries were hiring them and some of them were marrying Irish immigrant and American women. And there was this great fear that there was going to be this quote mongrel race. I kid you not. That kind of language in the newspapers and in public discourse about the Asian immigrants in California in particular. So crazy stuff, right? So at any rate, when we look at data for and against Turner's thesis, yes, there arguably now was attainable land by way of squatters' rights, by way of purchasing, by way of stealing from Native Americans. There were entrepreneurial activities if you were quick enough on your feet, like for instance, to mine the miners, find something that the miners were willing to pay for, a service or a product, and provide it for them. The Mormons provided ferry crossings across infamous rivers that were dangerous and made a lot of money from that. Sam Brannan sold pickaxes and basic mining tools to the miners in San Francisco heading into the gold mines and became a millionaire from that alone. There were opportunities, absolutely, that were virtually open to a lot of people in the West. There was, like I mentioned, a virtual state of anarchy for a while there in Gold Rush, California, in certain areas before it became a state. Um, but at the same time, right, after the placer or superficial level gold was found, how are you going to get hundreds of feet into a mine? You can't with a pickaxe in your own arms. You need a pneumatic or hydraulic drill. You need a big fancy machine that costs thousands of dollars. That's impossible. So who was able to afford the pneumatic and hydraulic drill? The corporations, right? So as Alan Brinkley in the textbook states, most of the mineral wealth that was extracted well deep, hundreds of feet or yards into mines and mountains and so forth, mountainsides, and was extracted by corporations. And average people were only paid hourly wages. There was no commission often for finding gold. That gold belonged to the corporation if you found it, right? And the same thing with farming. Yeah, you could do a small parcel of land, but if you didn't have inside political leverage of where the best markets were going to be, where the railroad was tied, right? And you get into more of that in your history, 17B, with the cattle kingdom and all that after the Civil War. But there's evidence, right, that in cattle ranching and in farming, that it took money to make money. That those who had more money could buy more land, buy more cattle, sell more of them to the railroad depots and to the meat packing industry in Chicago. Could buy the harvester, the thresher, the combine, right, the reaper, mechanical reaper, and this expensive machinery that the poor couldn't, and you could pull a Walmart on them by economies of scale. You could largely outproduce them, undersell them, and put the small farmers out of business. So all of that is not considered by Turner, right? Those would be considered rebuttals to Turner's thesis that there was general equality of opportunity for everybody in the West. Okay, so are there any questions? You guys feel okay on this? On this assignment? Any thumbs up? All right, thank you, Ali. Good, good, good. All right. I noticed 8 though. Let me get here. I don't have 7 names.
Professor Koa,
Yes.
I do have a question. So, you know how you were talking about inequality within the West?
Yes.
So, how did the US come to get the phrase land of the opportunity?
That's just a thing, right? Is they that what you practice versus what you preach oftentimes in history are at odds with each other, right? And so but this is exactly, I mean, Turner's thesis basically, right? Is one of the origins of that term, this being a land of opportunity, that in particularly in the West, there was lots of open land, there were mineral rushes, because the gold rush was just the most famous of several mineral rushes. If you were there quickly enough that you could get lucky, right? You could have a cattle rush at the end of the Civil War that I briefly mentioned. that's pertinent to your 17B class. So yeah, Turner's thesis on the West, to whatever extent it is or is not true, that at least was the rhetoric. That's what they wanted us to believe, right? Was that the West in particular was a land of opportunity. You also have a guy named Horatio Algier in your 17B class, and he wrote Rags to Riches stories, and he wrote in defense of the robber barons, right? Like Carnegie and Rockefeller and others, contending that, hey, these aren't just unfair parasites who were taking over the steel industry and the oil industry, et cetera, but that this is still a land of opportunity. You could still rise from rags to riches, right? So you could look up Horatio Algier if you wanted. That's an interesting topic as well. So sources like that have given us, that kind of moniker that we hold to this day. That relative to other countries, this is a land of opportunity. But again, that's our rhetoric, right? That's what we preach. And to what extent we have practiced it is an entirely separate question. I hope I answered your question, huh?
Yeah, you did. That was pretty good. Thank
All
you.
right, thank you. All right, anybody else? You guys feel okay on this one, on this assignment? I hope so. All right. So if that's it, you guys, that's all I meant to cover. It's been an hour and a half. You guys have certainly earned your points. I think I'm going to put on my notes for it being so long. I'm going to give you at least 7. I'm going to give you 7 to 10 points extra this time for hanging in there with me. Okay. So thank you. And you guys have a great day. Have a great week. And hang in there. We're getting toward the end.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff.